In late 1944, deep within the war-torn forests of the Ardennes, First Lieutenant Michael Corrigan, commander of an M10 tank destroyer, vanished along with his four-man crew. They were part of a vast American push, a spear tip aimed at the heart of the crumbling Reich. One moment, Corrigan's unit, call sign Anvil, was advancing through the dense, snow-dusted pines. The next, they were gone. Radio silence. No wreckage, no distress call, nothing but an unnerving void in the Allied line. The initial investigation, conducted under the constant threat of enemy fire and the punishing winter, was brief and inconclusive. The prevailing theory was that Corrigan's M10, a formidable but thinly armored vehicle with an open-top turret, had taken a direct hit from a German 88, vaporizing the machine and its crew. It was a grim but common enough fate in the brutal attrition of the Western Front. Another theory, whispered among the exhausted GIs, was that the crew, young and worn down by the relentless fighting, had deserted, melting away into the chaos of a continent in flames. But with no evidence, and with thousands of men listed as missing in action, the case of Anvil and her crew went cold, filed away as another tragic, unanswered loss of the war. But 25 years later, in the summer of 1969, a French farmer named Jean-Luc Dubois, working a tract of land just outside the village of Saint-Vith, a plot his family had only acquired a decade prior as part of post-war reconstruction efforts, felt his plow lurch to a halt. The iron blades had struck something solid, something unyielding buried just beneath the rich soil. Believing it to be a stubborn boulder, he fetched his shovel. What he unearthed, however, was not stone, but a slab of rusted olive-drab steel. As he dug further, the unmistakable shape of a military vehicle began to emerge from the earth, not in pieces as one would expect from a catastrophic explosion, but eerily whole. It was an American M10 tank destroyer, swallowed by the forest floor and preserved in a tomb of mud and roots for a quarter of a century. The discovery sent a shockwave through the quiet Belgian countryside and across the Atlantic to the U.S. Army's European headquarters. The case of Lieutenant Corrigan and his men was violently torn open from the archives. Captain Evan Hayes, a sharp, intuitive investigator with the U.S. Army's Criminal Investigation Division, CID, was dispatched from his post in Germany to lead the inquiry. Hayes was part of a new generation of military men, too young to have fought in the Great War, but tasked with cleaning up its lingering messes. He arrived in Saint-Vith with a sense of grim determination, a feeling that this was more than a simple recovery mission. The initial reports from the excavation site were perplexing. The M10 was almost entirely intact, its hull showing no signs of a high-velocity projectile impact. It seemed to have been driven into a deep, muddy ravine and then deliberately buried. Inside the crew compartment, a scene of disquieting stillness awaited them. The remains of 4 American soldiers were found, not blown apart, but slumped at their stations. It was as if they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. But there should have been 5. The M10 Wolverine carried a crew of 5, a commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Lieutenant Corrigan, the commander, was missing. As Hayes stood on the edge of the excavation pit, the fluorescent lights of the recovery team humming in the twilight, he stared at the resurrected ghost from the past. The official story, a direct hit, a combat loss, was a lie. This was no battlefield grave. This was a crime scene. And somewhere out there, after 25 years of silence, a killer might still be watching. Captain Evan Hayes felt the damp chill of the Ardennes morning seep into his bones, a cold that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, as if the forest still held the memory of the brutal winter of '44. He stood beside the exhumed M10 tank destroyer, its olive-drab paint faded to a sickly green, streaks of rust weeping from its seams like old wounds. The vehicle had been transported to a secure hangar at a nearby U.S. military base, where it sat under the harsh, sterile glow of industrial lighting. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, oil, and something else decay. Hayes, a man whose serious demeanor and piercing gaze made him seem older than his 32 years, ran a gloved hand along the cold steel of the turret. His mind was a maelstrom of questions, each one snagging on the jagged edges of the initial reports. The vehicle was intact, the crew remains were inside, but there was no sign of a battle. The misleading narrative of a direct hit from an enemy shell had already evaporated, replaced by a much darker and more complex mystery. His second-in-command, Master Sergeant Frank Rizzo, a gruff, stocky veteran who had seen combat in Korea, approached with a clipboard. "Sir, forensics just gave us a preliminary. The 4 men inside, no signs of projectile wounds. No shrapnel. Their dog tags confirm their identities: Sergeant Miller, Corporal Chun, Private First Class Gallo, and Private Kowalski. All members of Lieutenant Corrigan's crew. Hayes turned, his eyes locking onto Rizzo's. "What was the cause of death, Frank?" Rizzo hesitated, his brow furrowing. "That's the strange part, sir. They're saying it looks like asphyxiation. The M10's engine was a twin diesel. The initial theory is that maybe they were running the engine for warmth in a concealed position. The ventilation failed, and they were overcome by carbon monoxide fumes. An accident." Hayes shook his head slowly, his gaze drifting back to the tank. It felt too simple, too neat. An accident where the entire vehicle gets buried in a ravine? And where is Lieutenant Corrigan? He wouldn't just walk away and leave his men. It doesn't fit the profile of a commanding officer. His intuition, that gut feeling that had served him so well in other cases, was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the accident theory. He walked around to the front of the tank destroyer, crouching to examine the driver's hatch. It was closed. He peered at the hull, searching for any detail that seemed out of place. It was then that he saw it. Tucked into the recess of the front toe shackle, almost perfectly preserved by the mud that had encased it for 25 years, was a small object. It wasn't standard military issue. It wasn't a piece of the tank. It was a silver cigarette lighter, elegantly thin, with a faded but discernible engraving on its side, a stylized crest he didn't recognize. This was the anomaly. A personal item, perhaps, but it felt significant. Why was it on the outside of the vehicle? Who did it belong to? Hayes carefully placed the lighter in an evidence bag, the weight of it in his palm feeling disproportionate to its size. It was the first real clue in a case that had been dormant for a quarter of a century. He knew he needed to understand the past to solve the present. That meant digging into the archives, reading the after-action reports from Corrigan's unit, and most importantly, speaking to anyone who was there. His investigation began with a trip to the nearby town of St. Vith, a place that had been rebuilt from the ashes of the war. There, he sought out the local authorities and any residents old enough to remember the battle. He was introduced to the town's mayor, a man named Bernard Dubois, no relation to the farmer who found the tank. Bernard was a pillar of the community, a celebrated philanthropist who had been instrumental in the post-war reconstruction of the region. He was in his late 50s, with a polished demeanor and an air of quiet authority. He had been a young man during the war, a member of the local resistance. He welcomed Captain Hayes with a warm handshake and an offer of complete cooperation. "A terrible tragedy, Captain," Bernard said, his voice laced with a somber, practiced sympathy as they sat in his well-appointed office. "I remember the battle well. The confusion, the noise, so many brave young men lost. We owe them a debt we can never repay. Anything my office or the town can do to help you bring closure to this case, you have my word." Hayes, ever the keen observer of human behavior, noted the man's polished exterior. Bernard seemed genuinely helpful, providing maps of the area from 1944 and a list of other elderly residents who might have memories of the American soldiers. But as Hayes laid out the details of the discovery, the buried tank, the lack of battle damage, the missing commander, he saw a flicker of something in the mayor's eyes. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, a momentary tightening of the muscles around his jaw, a subtle shift in his posture. It was a look not of surprise, but of recognition. Hayes's internal alarm bells began to ring. The hidden-in-plain-sight villain often wore a mask of respectability. He filed the observation away, a seed of suspicion planted in the back of his mind. He knew the unveiling of the truth would require him to methodically peel back layers of deception, starting with the town's esteemed leader. The silver lighter felt heavier in his pocket. It was a key, but the lock was 25 years old and buried deep in the secrets of this rebuilt town. The investigation deepened, pulling Captain Hayes into the sepia-toned world of 1944. He and Sergeant Rizzo established a makeshift command post in a spare room at the local gendarmerie, the walls quickly becoming a mosaic of maps, photographs of the crew, and technical schematics of the M10 Wolverine. The initial theory of accidental carbon monoxide poisoning, while plausible on the surface, continued to unravel the more Hayes examined the physical evidence. The forensics team had confirmed high levels of carbon monoxide in the sealed crew compartment, but they also noted that the engine's exhaust system showed no signs of malfunction. For the compartment to fill with fumes so quickly and lethally, the vehicle would have had to be in an enclosed space with the engine running. A deep, muddy ravine, open to the sky, didn't quite fit. Furthermore, the act of burying the entire 29-ton vehicle would have required heavy machinery, something not readily available to a tank crew on the front lines. It suggested a third party, a deliberate and calculated effort to conceal the M10 and its occupants. Hayes's focus shifted to the missing commander, Lieutenant Michael Corrigan. He was the void at the center of the mystery. He requested Corrigan's service record from the National Archives. The file painted a picture of a competent and respected officer, an innocent in the grand, brutal theater of war. He was young, only 23, and had been awarded a Bronze Star for valor during the Normandy campaign. Letters to his family, which were included in the file, spoke of his crew with pride and affection. There was no hint of discord, no suggestion of any behavior that might lead to desertion or foul play within the unit. The misleading narrative of Corrigan abandoning his men felt increasingly unlikely. The next step was to track down surviving members of Corrigan's unit, the 603rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. After weeks of cross-referencing military records with current addresses, Hayes and Rizzo identified a handful of veterans scattered across the United States. Hayes spent long hours on transatlantic phone calls, his questions precise and probing. The conversations were often difficult, forcing old men to dredge up memories they had long since buried. Most remembered Lieutenant Corrigan and his crew, but none could shed light on their disappearance. They all recounted the same story: a chaotic advance, a sudden winter storm that reduced visibility to near zero, and then the chilling realization that Anvil was no longer responding to radio calls. The official story of a direct hit had been accepted without question. It was a war, and in war men vanished. However, one veteran, a former sergeant named Arthur Jenkins living in Ohio, provided a crucial piece of information. Jenkins had been the commander of another M10 in the same platoon. "I remember that day," Jenkins's voice crackled over the phone line, heavy with the weight of years. "The snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see the tank in front of you. We were pushing through the forest, trying to outflank a German position. Corrigan was a good officer, by the book. But he had a streak of independence. A gut player." Hayes leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad. "What do you mean, Sergeant?" "He trusted his instincts," Jenkins explained. "A few days before they went missing, we'd received intel about a local resistance cell operating in the area. The locals were helping downed airmen and providing intel. Corrigan was keen on making contact. He thought they could give us a better lay of the land than our outdated maps. Command had warned us to be cautious, that German infiltrators were posing as partisans. But Mike, he believed in the cause. He believed in people. This was new. It opened up a completely different avenue of investigation. If Corrigan had made contact with the local resistance, it could explain why he might have deviated from the planned route. It also introduced a new cast of characters into the drama. Back in St. Vith, Hayes decided to pay another visit to Mayor Bernard Dubois, the former resistance fighter. He wanted to probe this new line of inquiry without revealing his hand. He presented it as a routine historical question, an attempt to understand the operational context of the time. "Mayor Dubois," Hayes began, sitting once again in the mayor's tidy office, "we're trying to reconstruct the final days of Lieutenant Corrigan's crew. I understand you were active in the local resistance. Did your group have any contact with American units in this sector in late 1944? Bernard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of him. His expression was one of thoughtful reminiscence. "It's difficult to say for certain, Captain. It was a very fluid situation. We helped where we could, but our primary concern was survival and avoiding German patrols. We occasionally passed information to Allied command through established channels, but direct contact with frontline units was rare and extremely dangerous. For them and for us." His answer was smooth, plausible, and utterly non-committal. Hayes pressed gently. "Do you recall any rumors or reports of an American tank crew seeking to make contact around that time?" For the briefest of moments, the same flicker Hayes had seen before returned to the mayor's eyes. It was a shadow of a memory, quickly suppressed. "No, Captain. I can't say that I do. A lone tank would have been a liability. We would have advised them to return to their lines." As Hayes left the mayor's office, his suspicion intensified. Bernard Dubois was hiding something. His denial was too polished, his memory too selective. The man who had built his reputation on the foundations of post-war recovery seemed determined to keep the past buried. Later that day, the forensics report on the silver cigarette lighter came back. The engraved crest was identified as the emblem of a pre-war Belgian industrial firm, a company that had been taken over by the Germans during the occupation and was notorious for its use of forced labor. The company's regional headquarters in 1944 had been a chateau just a few kilometers from where the M10 was discovered. The name of the firm's collaborationist Belgian director? A man named Jean-Pierre Moreau. A quick check of post-war records revealed that Moreau had been tried for collaboration, but was acquitted due to lack of evidence, with several local resistance members testifying on his behalf, claiming he had secretly funneled information to them. One of the key witnesses who spoke in his defense was a young, decorated resistance hero named Bernard Dubois. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a dark and unsettling picture. Corrigan's gut feeling had led him to the resistance, and the resistance, it seemed, was connected to a collaborationist industrialist. And at the center of it all was the town's respected mayor. Hayes felt a surge of adrenaline. The slow burn of the investigation was about to accelerate. He was no longer just searching for a missing officer. He was unveiling a conspiracy, a 25-year-old betrayal hidden beneath a veneer of civic pride and wartime heroism. The revelation of the link between Mayor Bernard Dubois and the collaborationist industrialist Jean-Pierre Moreau transformed the investigation. Captain Hayes felt as though he had scraped away a layer of meticulously applied varnish to find rot and decay underneath. The silver lighter was no longer just an anomaly. It was a direct link to the darker side of the war, a time when allegiances were murky and survival often came at a terrible price. He tasked Sergeant Rizzo with a deep dive into the post-war trial of Moreau. The records were yellowed and brittle, stored in a dusty archive in Brussels, but they told a fascinating story. Moreau's company had been a cog in the German war machine, producing munitions and machine parts. The case against him had been strong, with documents proving his willing cooperation with the occupiers. Yet, he walked free. The testimony of Bernard Dubois and two other resistance members had been pivotal. They claimed Moreau was a double agent, a patriot who used his position to gather intelligence for the Allies. It seemed plausible on the surface, but Hayes's instinct told him it was a carefully constructed lie. Why would a hero of the resistance lie to protect a collaborator? The answer, Hayes suspected, lay in the one thing that motivated so many dark deeds: greed. While Rizzo was in Brussels, Hayes turned his attention to the chateau that had served as Moreau's headquarters. It was a grand, crumbling estate that had been abandoned after the war and was now owned by the state, slated for demolition. Hayes obtained permission to search the property, hoping to find something, anything, that had been left behind. He walked through the decaying rooms, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The place had been picked clean over the years, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken history. In what had been the director's office, he noticed that a section of the ornate parquet floor was slightly raised. Prying it open with his combat knife, he discovered a small, lead-lined box hidden in the subfloor. Inside was a leather-bound ledger. The ledger contained meticulous, handwritten entries detailing secret transactions. It wasn't a record of munitions production. It was a list of priceless art, gold bullion, and other valuables that had been looted from Jewish families and Belgian institutions. Moreau had been using his position not just to aid the Germans, but to amass a personal fortune. And next to several entries detailing the transfer of gold bars in late 1944 were the initials BD. Bernard Dubois. The motive was suddenly crystal clear. Moreau and Dubois had been in business together. Dubois had used his position in the resistance to facilitate Moreau's looting, likely in exchange for a substantial cut of the profits. After the war, Dubois had repaid the favor by ensuring Moreau's acquittal, cementing his own reputation as a hero while burying their shared crimes. But how did Lieutenant Corrigan and his crew fit into this? Hayes theorized that Corrigan, acting on his gut, had indeed made contact with the resistance. But instead of finding patriots, he had stumbled upon Bernard Dubois. Perhaps Corrigan became suspicious. Perhaps he saw something he wasn't supposed to see at the chateau: a delivery, a meeting, a cache of stolen gold. The M10 tank destroyer, with its powerful 76.2mm M7 gun, would have been a significant threat to Dubois and Moreau's operation. They couldn't let him report what he'd found. This theory provided the motive for murder, but not the method. The strange, passive deaths of the crew remained a haunting puzzle. Rizzo returned from Brussels with more damning information. He had found a witness, an elderly clerk who had worked at the courthouse during the trials. The clerk remembered the Moreau case vividly. He told Rizzo that there had been a fifth set of remains reported by the resistance around the same time Corrigan's crew vanished, an unidentified American officer, found shot to death near the chateau. The body was never officially identified and was buried in a temporary mass grave. The report had been signed off on and filed away by the ranking local authority at the time, Bernard Dubois. It had to be Lieutenant Corrigan. He hadn't vanished, he had been executed. The pieces were locking into place with terrifying speed. Hayes now had a clear narrative. Lieutenant Corrigan, the determined investigator of his time, had followed his intuition and uncovered a conspiracy. He had confronted Dubois or Moreau and had been murdered for it. But that still left the 4 men in the tank. How were they killed, and why was the vehicle so carefully buried? Hayes returned his focus to the M10 itself. He went back to the hangar, walking around the silent machine, trying to see it not as a weapon of war, but as a tomb. He imagined the crew inside, waiting for their commander to return from his meeting. What had happened? He considered the carbon monoxide theory again. What if it wasn't an accident? What if it was deliberate? He pictured the scene, the M10 concealed in the ravine, its powerful diesel engine running to keep the crew warm in the biting cold. An external party could have blocked the exhaust and let the fumes do the work, a silent, deadly execution that would leave no bullet holes. Then, using machinery from Moreau's factory, they could have pushed earth and rock down into the ravine, burying the evidence deep in the forest. It was a clinical, remorseless plan. The villain, hidden in plain sight, had not only committed a murder, but had orchestrated a scene to look like a tragic accident, a story that had held for 25 years. Hayes felt a cold fury rise within him. Bernard Dubois was more than just a thief. He was a cold-blooded killer who had wrapped himself in a flag of heroism. Now, all Hayes needed was the final piece of evidence, the confession that would shatter the mayor's carefully constructed world. He arranged a meeting with Dubois at the hangar, telling him there had been a significant new development in the case. The confrontation was coming. The air in the hangar was cold and heavy with the scent of old steel and gasoline. The M10 tank destroyer, Anvil, sat under the stark glare of the overhead lights, a silent, colossal witness to a 25-year-old crime. Captain Evan Hayes stood beside the vehicle, waiting. He had arranged the meeting carefully, ensuring he and Sergeant Rizzo were the only ones present with the mayor. He wanted the confrontation to be direct, personal, and inescapable. Bernard Dubois arrived punctually, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He still wore the mask of the concerned civic leader, his expression a mixture of curiosity and somber respect. "Captain Hayes," he began, his voice smooth and controlled. "You said there was a development. I hope it is good news for the families of these brave men." Hayes didn't offer a handshake. He gestured towards the tank destroyer. "We've confirmed the cause of death for the 4 men inside, Mayor. Carbon monoxide poisoning." Bernard nodded slowly, his face a perfect picture of sympathy. "A terrible accident. As I said, the war was a time of great confusion. A tragic mistake, no doubt." "It wasn't a mistake," Hayes said, his voice dropping, becoming hard as granite. "It was murder." The mayor's practiced composure finally cracked. A flicker of alarm crossed his face before being swiftly replaced by an expression of indignant disbelief. "Murder? Captain, that's a preposterous accusation. Who would murder American soldiers?" Hayes took a step closer, his eyes locked on Dubois. "Someone with a secret to protect. Someone who was running a looting operation with a Nazi collaborator named Jean-Pierre Moreau. Someone who used his position in the resistance as a cover for his crimes." He let the words hang in the cold air. He saw the color drain from Bernard's face. The mayor opened his mouth to speak, to issue a denial, but Hayes gave him no quarter. He held up a clear evidence bag containing the silver cigarette lighter. "We found this on the tank. The crest is from Moreau's company. A company you testified to save from prosecution after the war." Bernard stared at the lighter as if it were a venomous snake. His facade was crumbling, revealing the cold, calculating man beneath. "That proves nothing," he hissed, his voice losing its polished edge. "A lost item. It could have been there for any number of reasons." "Perhaps," Hayes conceded, his tone deceptively calm. "But then there's the matter of the 5th body. An unidentified American officer, shot in the head, found near Moreau's chateau in the winter of 1944. A report that you personally signed off on before having the body disposed of in an unmarked grave. That was Lieutenant Corrigan, wasn't it, Bernard? He found out about you and Moreau. He stumbled upon your dirty little secret." Each word was a hammer blow, systematically destroying the foundation of lies Dubois had built his life upon. The mayor's eyes darted around the hangar, searching for an escape that wasn't there. He was trapped between the unyielding investigator and the silent, accusing hulk of the M10. Sergeant Rizzo, standing near the hangar door, shifted his weight, a subtle but clear message that there would be no exit. He was a fool, Bernard finally spat, the venom of his true nature spilling out. The confession had begun. An arrogant American boy playing soldier. He came to me, asking for help, for information. I brought him to the chateau, intending to give him some useless intelligence to send him on his way. But he was intuitive. He saw things. He noticed the trucks, the crates. He asked too many questions. The mayor's voice became clinical, detached, as he recounted the events of that snowy day a quarter of a century ago. It was the matter-of-fact confession of a true psychopath. Corrigan confronted me in Moreau's office. He threatened to report us to his command. He was idealistic. He didn't understand that war is about survival, about opportunity. I tried to reason with him, to buy him off. But he was incorruptible. Bernard paused, a sneer twisting his lips. So I killed him. A single shot. It was necessary. A business decision. And his crew? Hayes prompted, his voice tight with controlled rage. They were waiting for him back at their tank, hidden in a ravine near the chateau. They were running the engine to stay warm. It was pathetically easy. We found a length of pipe at the factory, attached it to the exhaust, and ran it up to the open-top turret. They never knew what was happening. They just went to sleep. He spoke of the murder of 4 men, as if he were describing a mundane task. The clinical remorselessness was chilling. Moreau had a bulldozer at the factory. We used it to collapse the sides of the ravine, burying the tank. It was the perfect crime. A tragic combat loss. No one would ever look for them there. And who would question me? I was a hero of the resistance. He said the word hero with a final, bitter irony. The mask was gone completely, revealing the monster that had been hiding in plain sight for 25 years. The man who had rebuilt St. Vith, the celebrated philanthropist, was a thief and a murderer, his entire life built upon a foundation of stolen gold and the bodies of innocent men. Hayes felt a profound sense of grim satisfaction. He had followed his own intuition, just as Corrigan had. He had trusted his gut over the simple, logical explanation. He had given a voice to the silent victims and uncovered a truth that had been buried for a generation. "It's over, Du Bois," Hayes said, the authority of the U.S. Army and the weight of justice in his voice. "You're under arrest." As Rizzo moved forward to cuff him, Bernard Du Bois, the hidden villain, looked one last time at the M10 tank destroyer, his expression not of remorse, but of cold, bitter defeat. The past had finally caught up to him. The confession of Bernard Du Bois sent shockwaves far beyond the cold confines of the hangar. The arrest of the celebrated mayor of St. Vith, a man lauded as a war hero and a pillar of the community, became an international story. The tale of betrayal, greed, and murder, hidden for 25 years, was a stark and brutal reminder of the war's lingering shadows. For Captain Evan Hayes, the resolution of the case brought a somber sense of closure. His methodical investigation, driven by an intuition that mirrored the victim's own, had peeled back the layers of deception to reveal a horrifying truth. Justice, delayed for a quarter of a century, would finally be served. Following his confession, Bernard Du Bois was tried by a joint tribunal of American military and Belgian authorities. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledger from the chateau, the testimony of the courthouse clerk, the forensic evidence from the M10, and his own chillingly detailed account of the murders. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison, stripped of his honors and his reputation, left to live out his days as a symbol of the deepest human treachery. Jean-Pierre Moreau, the collaborationist industrialist, had died of a heart attack in 1962, taking the full extent of his crimes to the grave, but the posthumous revelation of his activities led to the seizure of his remaining assets, which were used to establish a fund for war victims and their families. The most emotionally resonant part of the resolution, however, was providing closure for the victims. The remains of the 4 crewmen, Sergeant Miller, Corporal Chun, Private First Class Gallo, and Private Kowalski, were treated with the full honors they had been denied for so long. The U.S. Army's Graves Registration Service, the precursor to the modern mortuary affairs, took painstaking care in preparing them for their final journey home. Their families, who for 25 years had lived with the uncertainty of a missing in action notice, were finally given the truth. There were now grandchildren who would learn the story of the grandfathers they never met, not as men who vanished, but as soldiers who were victims of a terrible crime. Hayes made it his personal duty to oversee the search for Lieutenant Michael Corrigan's remains. Based on Du Bois's confession and the post-war burial records, a team of forensic archaeologists excavated a section of the old, defunct cemetery where the temporary mass grave had been located. It didn't take long. They found the remains of a single American officer, and dental records from Corrigan's military file confirmed his identity. The young lieutenant who had trusted his gut and paid the ultimate price had been found. The 5 members of the M10 crew Anvil were finally reunited, not in the cold mud of the Ardennes, but in the hallowed ground of Arlington National Cemetery. Hayes attended the funeral, standing at a respectful distance as the 5 flag-draped caskets were lowered into the earth. The sound of a 21-gun salute cracked through the solemn air, a final, belated tribute to their sacrifice. He watched as an elderly woman, Corrigan's younger sister and his last living immediate relative, was presented with the folded American flag. Her quiet tears were a testament to a grief that had spanned a generation. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Hayes remained for a moment, looking at the 5 fresh graves. The case had been a journey into the past, a dialogue with ghosts. He had unraveled a misleading narrative and, through the methodical unveiling of the truth, brought a hidden-in-plain-sight villain to justice. The innocent victims, whose memory had been the emotional core of his investigation, could finally rest in peace. The cold case of the vanished fighter tank commander was closed. Driving away from the cemetery, Hayes felt the weight of the last few months settle upon him. He had confronted the darkness that can hide behind a mask of respectability and had affirmed his belief in the power of persistent, intuitive investigation. The world was full of secrets buried under the soil of time, but every now and then, a piece of rusted steel, a forgotten ledger, or a single, out-of-place cigarette lighter could bring them violently into the light, ensuring that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually be heard.